What do you make of the apparent theater around the protests? 100,000 protesters descending on Chicago at the DNC. What do we make of what we're seeing this week?
Well, I mean, we'll see how it unfolds, but my sense so far is that it's a managed spectacle. If you look at the last Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968, it wasn't a spectacle. It was real, blood on the streets, real rioting, and a real radical left-wing revolutionary movement that wanted to assert itself against what they saw as the Democratic establishment. That kicked off about a half decade of bombings, airline hijackings, assassinations, and other incidents of political violence. And so I don't think we're going to get that. I think what we have now is almost the reprise of that in a kind of theater kid form. So you have people who I don't think have necessarily that kind of militant conviction, but they want to adopt some of those aesthetics, some of that rhetoric from the past. And so they'll be hitting the streets, and we'll see. Is it something that is a serious militant conviction? Is it just kind of play? But my sense politically is that this benefits Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris can now pretend that she is tacking to the center. She can pretend to, silence the pro-Hamas protesters, and then position herself, I think, in a misleading sense, but position herself as the moderate candidate.
Yeah, it's interesting. That was actually my take on this as well. I think there were some Republicans actually who were upset at that framing of it. But I think that that's actually got to be what's going on here, which is that, of course, a lot of this is organic. There are crazy people across the board that are genuinely think of themselves as crusaders for justice from the left. So I don't think it's that Kamala Harris's camp is necessarily planting these protesters, but I think that they're not super upset about its existence either. And as long as they maintain the balance of it not totally overthrowing their convention, it comes out as actually a better scenario, because there's no better way to sell yourself to the public as a fake moderate. I don't think she's a moderate. I don't think she's much of anything. That's a different question. But to sell yourself to the public as a thoughtful moderate than to be assailed by the people on the far left, such that when Republicans say that, oh, you're a communist, no, the real communists have shown up, and now you get to say, oh, no, I'm just the centrist that they don't like so much because I'm so moderate. So it does seem like a good way for her to pull off a trick that otherwise would have been harder for her to pull off if the protests hadn't been there. That's my take on it, at least.
Yeah, I largely agree. And I mean, we'll find out. The downside or the risk on the other side of that strategy is if things do get out of control. She could appear weak. She could appear unorganized. You can have a chaotic movement that could kick up. And so, as a partisan on the other side, I hope that she is not able to get away with it. And I hope that the activists and the demonstrators put some real pressure on her. And then we'll see how she acts under pressure, because, leadership is really decision-making under pressure. Kamala Harris has been shielded from decision-making within the administration. She's, of course, vice president. They don't actually make any decisions for the most part. But also she's been shielded in the first part of this campaign, which is just a full-blown Soviet-style propaganda campaign from the media that tries to cover her from any unscripted moments, cover her from having to take any positions, and really cover her from scrutiny. And so the best case scenario in the next few days is if she's forced to make decisions under pressure, and then the American people can have a bit better sense of her judgment and sense of her leadership ability.
Do you actually think she is ideological? It's actually a question I've wondered about.
Yeah, I go back and forth on that. That's a great question, because it's not immediately clear. I think she is ideological. You get a sense when she speaks that there is some ideological motive that she has. But I think more than ideological, she's ambitious.
Yeah,
and she's
that much I think is clear. That's a little different.
Yeah, I think she's created the persona that kind of allows her to be everything to everyone, and then she just manages whatever way that the winds are blowing. She manages to position herself, position the sails to take her to where she wants to go. And so, it's hard to say. And what I would say that we know for sure is that, when it's unpopular, she's willing to jettison all of her positions. And so I think she's a creature of ambition, and I think she's a creature of incentives. She has a keen sense of incentives. And so The question is not really what does Kamala Harris believe. I actually don't think that's an important question at all. The question is what are the incentives that are going to be around Kamala Harris that will guide her to make whatever decisions seem most favorable at the time. That I think is a more difficult question, but perhaps a more important question.
Yeah, I lean in the direction of that being by far the more important question for people who want to understand what the country is actually going to look like under Kamala Harris. I think calling her ideological is to give her too much credit, actually. I don't believe she's particularly ideological, unlike a Bernie Sanders, right? She tried to position herself on one hand when she ran for California Attorney General as some kind of moderate, tough on crime figure. I do think it's worth remembering the Democrats hit her for prosecuting too many people. It's also part of the reason why I think it's a little bit of a weak and unconvincing and self-defeating Republican attack when Republicans started to initially say, oh, she locked up too many black men or whatever. That was actually the left attack on her when she ran for president in 2020, which ironically makes her seem more tough on crime than she actually is, which again does her the favor in the same way these left-wing protesters are doing by making her seem like something she's not. I think the reality is she tried to pretend to be a moderate when she was in the role as leading prosecutor in the state of California, only to become an apparent ideologue running almost to the left of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren in that primary, which I think didn't convince anybody in the Democratic Party, which is why she didn't make it to the Iowa caucus, only to now convert back to being the centrist moderate in a way that supposedly she thinks is her path to winning this election. I think far more compelling from my vantage point, at least, is what I think is true, is that she's just another example of a puppet in a system. Right? Biden was a puppet that they wielded, and I think that Kamala Harris is a new puppet that actually can be controlled far more easily than a true ideologue like a Bernie Sanders or even Elizabeth Warren, who I do think are far more ideological Democrats than one like Kamala Harris, which I think shows up far more in the breed of the pawn. And those are two different strategies, depending on what we think is the right theory of the case here for what the Republican criticism of her actually is. I find it much more compelling to say we're running against a system rather than against an individual candidate. But that's different than saying that she's a communist, which is what Bernie Sanders is certainly closer to and what she has sounded like in the past. And I do think that's an interesting fork in the road that we're going to have to take if we want to win over independents and voters, to have some consistency to what our actual message is here on our criticism of her.